Welcome to Coffee with Coker, a healthcare business podcast from the Coker Group that focuses on solutions to help healthcare organizations effectively navigate the changing healthcare industry landscape. I'm your host, Mark Reiboldt. I'm a senior vice president at Coker. And for more information on Coffee with Coker, for listening to past episodes, please visit us at coffeewithcoker.com. You can also find us at cokergroup.com. And you'll find a list of all the episodes that we've recorded and more information on each one of them. Today, we're talking with a couple of guests, and we're talking about what lies ahead for physicians and hospitals in America. And we're talking with Coker's president and CEO, Max Reiboldt. And also joining us is Tom Anthony, who is chair of the healthcare practice at Frost, Brown and Todd, a prominent healthcare law firm out of Ohio. And Max and Tom, I think, have a great discussion on looking at some of the key trends that we're looking at and looking forward to in the healthcare industry, and specifically talking about things that we think are coming down the pipe pretty soon here as we're going closely now into 2019, and specifically things that we think will have a significant impact on both physicians and hospitals all over the country. So I hope you enjoy the episode. If for more information on past episodes or more details on this episode and the things we talk about, you can find us at coffeewithcoker.com, and you can submit feedback or questions on this or any other topic that we've talked about or may talk about in the future, and you can reach out to us at feedback@cokergroup.com or on social media, Twitter at Coker Group, or on LinkedIn. Just search for Coker Group and you'll find our page, and feel free to contact us at any one of those resources. Again, we hope you enjoy, and we look forward to this episode with Max and Tom. Thank you. Welcome back to another episode of Coffee with Coker. We are talking about what lies ahead for physicians and hospitals in America. So I think this is an interesting topic that, there's a lot we could cover here. I'm bringing in one guest who has been on the podcast before, and I think our listeners will be familiar with. That's Max Reiboldt, who is the CEO of Coker Group. And we also have Tom Anthony joining us as well for the first time. And Tom is a very prominent healthcare attorney. Max and Tom have presented on this topic at a conference for the American Health Lawyers Association. And again, it's something that got a lot of interest. And so we wanted to dive in a little bit deeper, talking about from a broad perspective what we think lies ahead in the healthcare industry, specifically for physicians and hospitals, but kind of drill down on some of those components that Max and Tom talked about in the AHLA presentation. So welcome, Max and Tom.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So let's just dive right in. As we record this, we're approaching, it's kind of crazy to think about the end of 2018. And as we're recording this, we're right in the heart of election season. So that's one interesting component here, is healthcare is a big issue there in these midterm elections. If we're talking about the healthcare industry and kind of the transformation that we've seen leading up to 2018 and through 2018, but over the last few years, maybe just comment briefly on where you guys think the current state of the healthcare industry is today.
Well, this is Max, and I'll jump in. And first of all, thanks very much. It's an honor to be on this podcast with Tom Anthony. Tom is the chair of the healthcare law practice of Frost, Brown, Todd. He's based in Cincinnati. So, Tom, it's a real honor to just be on the panel with you. To answer your question and kick things off, Mark, boy, what isn't happening within healthcare these days? I've been involved directly with the Coker Group now for, almost 26 years, I think. And it's never been a dull moment, and certainly this is no exception. I think some of the key takeaway points that I would get our discussion kicked off with is that there's still tremendous amounts of interest in where healthcare is going in this country among three major sectors. And not surprisingly, that would be the patients or the consumer. Secondly, the providers, the physicians and hospitals. And specifically, I know our podcast is going to focus on that today. And then last but not least is the payers. And of course, that's everything from the government and the regulatory components thereof, as well as the third-party insurance companies. So I think with all these three points of interest in mind, there is change that is going on. There's still a lot of transactional activity, meaning there are deals being done amongst all these parties and others, private investors as well. That's a big part of it. Clearly, the interest of patients in terms of their cost of health insurance and even how this is going to affect them in later years of life, vis-a-vis the government and supplemental insurance and where to go to get that is another major interest. I think the consumer is better educated than ever today. And so I think clearly we're dealing with that. And then I'll just stop, and I want Tom to comment because I know he's very knowledgeable on the compliance and regulatory parts of this, but as well as other features because I've worked with him on a lot of projects. But technology is yet again another major driver. And that's not only the technology that the providers and the insurance companies and the government have, but even when I say technology, I'm talking about the technological advances within the industry and how that is changing the delivery of care. Maybe I'll even get into a couple of examples such as telemedicine here in a moment. But Tom, I'll throw it over to you. I know you probably have some good input on this question as well.
Well, thank you, Max. And it's truly a privilege to be included in this today with you. And we're delighted to both work with you on projects and on the podcast. But you're absolutely right. The three major economic factors or components that are battling in this situation are the consumers, the providers, and the payers. The systems that deliver the care the best align all three of those. And that's the challenge, is that, they're all competitors, but everybody has the best results when they all work together. And that, I think, is, as you said, the major change in healthcare in the United States, because if you look back at the way healthcare was delivered in this country, this is a truly massive change. The old systems included fee-for-service, so that the providers got paid based on volume. It included consumers or patients who, in most cases, never even knew what the cost of the healthcare was because of the insurance arrangements. And on the payer side, the payers were trying to manage the care, the delivery of care to its enrolled insureds, the patients, but had very limited data systems that usually provided information to the payers with such a long delay, 3-6 months even, that it was virtually impossible for them to truly manage the cost of care, that is the payments to the doctors and hospitals, on a real-time basis. And instead, they had this huge obstacle in front of them of, the time delay that prevented them from being very efficient. But things have changed a lot with the advent of the technological advances you just described. The ability of all three sectors, patients, providers, and payers, to access one another, to access information, to be effective and efficient, is completely different from the way it was even 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and certainly vastly different from the way it was in the 1990s. So yes, it's changing fast, it's changing dramatically, and every element is moving at light speed.
So I want to drill down on a couple of those things that you all mentioned. And of course, I know one of those is the intersection, or I guess more importantly, the consolidation and potentially the integration of those three key components or three kind of stakeholder groups. And Tom, I know you and your practice there has done a lot with your clients as it relates to transaction work. Of course, Coker being involved for many years on the merger and acquisition advisory side of things, and transaction services have been involved in a lot of this consolidation that's happened in recent years. I think one of the interesting things to take away there is how one element of this intersection between whether it's patients and payers, or from a consumer perspective, or providers and payers from an economic perspective, but the consolidation that's taken place there. Maybe just comment on how that has really changed the landscape and will be a key component in looking forward.
Yes, the consolidation is nothing short of amazing. If you look on the side of just medical groups, the largest medical groups in the country today have 15 or 20,000 physicians in them. Team Health and other organizations like that are colossal compared to medical groups as recent as 5-10 years ago, where a large medical group would be 125, 150 physicians, or if it was a substantial organization of physicians like the Cleveland Clinic or Geisinger, then you might have many more physicians, but those were exceptions. Traditionally, a large medical group might be 15 or 20 practitioners, and the really big ones, like I said, 100, other than those integrated systems. So on the physician provider side, very, very significant consolidation, so that medical groups are affiliating with each other locally, regionally, statewide, multi-state, and creating much larger medical groups. That's just one side of it. Another side of it is that insurance companies are acquiring medical providers. For example, in Pittsburgh, an insurance company acquired the largest health system in the Pittsburgh region. Humana has made a number of acquisitions of medical providers, and so they're vertically integrating, putting together the payer and the provider in one organization to attempt to drive efficiencies and quality outcomes. Another form of consolidation is hospital systems, so that the largest hospital systems like HCA, Community, Trinity, and others are becoming much, much larger, each having hundreds of facilities. When you think about the efficiencies and the buying power that goes with that, as opposed to buying for one hospital, if you're buying for 200, imagine the kind of discounts and pricing you could demand as a buyer. That's another form. And another form of consolidation that is relatively new but extremely dramatic is non-healthcare providers are coming in and truly disrupting the industry. For example, CvS Pharmacies, with 10,000 retail sites, has acquired Aetna, the health insurance company, and they propose to deliver integrated care at their pharmacies, where the employees there are trained on health insurance and the purchasing needs of the enrolled members of Aetna. The patients who come in and they want their prescription filled, well, you also need this prosthetic, you also need this medication, and this is covered by your insurance, or this is not covered by your insurance. That's going on. Amazon, the online retailer, has begun opening its own pharmacies. And Walmart said they're going to start putting primary care offices in their 4,000 retail stores around the country, directly competing with primary care physicians. So Walmart, Amazon, CVS, very non-traditional healthcare organizations suddenly having an enormous presence in the delivery of care in this country.
And Tom and Mark, the other interesting facet about this is the models, the structures of these transactions are incredibly varied. It's not one size fits all. I remember dating myself a little bit in this industry, going back to the 90s, Essentially, it was a hospital that purchased, and I might say sometimes for somewhat inflated values those days, a medical practice, and then employed the staff and the physicians. As you know, that's no longer necessarily the norm. It is certainly a one of the transactions that is still taking place, but there are many others between hospitals, physicians. Private equity is a major player these days in purchasing practices and being involved in the practice side, in the management services side, some cases, and certainly in the ambulatory or ancillary sector of surgery centers, et cetera. So there's really no boundaries as to how we can construct a deal, other than, of course, we all have to stay, as I say, between the white lines of regulatory compliance. But really, it doesn't matter. It can be a professional services agreement. It could even be a clinically integrated network that is formed among a consortium of providers, and that can be the model or the structure that we launch this new, as I call it, new world order of provider care and ultimately reimbursement. And so I think it bodes well for all of us in the healthcare industry to educate ourselves on what is the landscape, the possible landscape, and how to somehow navigate through it. The challenge that we find, I might add quickly, is that it is, you've heard the expression herding cats. Well, sometimes that's what we feel like, just to try to get organized and say, okay, this is the best model and structure from whichever perspective you might be working with, whether it's the hospital or the medical group or the private equity firm or Walmart, anybody that comes to play on the playground here is going to have some different perspectives. I think that creates a lot of challenges, but I don't know, for me at my advanced age and experience level, at least number of years, I find it incredibly invigorating that there is all this variedness, if you will, and opportunities out there, and it's not one size fits all. And I'm personally very, very bullish on where I think we're going in our healthcare system, notwithstanding the issues and the problems. And goodness knows we don't want to get into politics right now, but even where the political landscape is or where it's headed. So I think the glass is half full, and let's see where we take it in terms of the next 5 years or so.
Yeah. And, the last thing I'll say on the whole consolidation piece here, and then we can move on to one of the other key drivers. But I think, and Tom, you mentioned it, and Max alluded to it as well. But I think the point about the kind of new or newer players that are coming into the market, there's no way we can ignore the impact they're having today, but more importantly, looking forward. If you look back 10 years, most of the consolidation that was happening was at a provider level. It was a lot of hospitals and physician groups. As we see some of these outside parties come in, and Tom, you alluded to some of the big ones, the ones that are kind of in the headlines these days: CVS, Aetna, Amazon, JP Morgan, Berkshire Hathaway, those types of things. But behind the scenes, we're seeing significant interest and activity from financial sponsors that are coming into the market, specifically private equity firms, institutional backed investment banks that are bringing significant dollars and capital resources to healthcare services. The interesting point here for me isn't just that these parties are interested. What I think is more interesting is that, again, if you look back just a few years ago, most of your physicians that were considering doing something assumed their sole option was a hospital. And that was kind of the perspective. And even then, when it started, again, Max, you alluded to this, but it started out as we just assumed the only option is employment. Well, that evolved to many other types of structures that could entail. Now, though, we're seeing that maybe the local hospital or health system isn't the only option for a group. There's potentially value there and kind of long-term partnership opportunities with an outside party, such as maybe a private equity firm or an organization that is backed by a private equity a firm that's more of a consortium type thing.
Yeah, you're so right. And, as Max was saying, there's no one size fits all. Not only are there a variety of potential investors, but the way the deals are done are also highly varied. And, the old saying, if you've seen one deal, you've seen one deal, is right, because the creativity and flexibility is available. Now, we're within a regulatory constraint, so, Stark law and a kickback have to be met. But the initial deals were employment because that was the easiest way to go. That was the low-hanging fruit, and so everybody did that. But then people began to realize employment is not necessarily the best answer. There's a lot of different ways to do these deals, and it has created an extremely dynamic and exciting environment.
Yeah, I agree so much there with Tom, and having worked with him in the past, I know he creates a lot of innovation. He's not just an attorney, your average healthcare attorney, and that's what one thing I've noticed over the years that I think is important as we work with clients. I do want to say that I think it's important, though, as we work with physicians and hospitals, the two main provider sectors within our system, that we try to keep in mind that there's some value and benefit and a great community need. In other words, a very critical place in the continuum of care for those two entities. Now, I realize there's long-term care, there's assisted living, there's multiple other providers, but when you boil it down, we're mainly referring to hospitals and physician groups, and I think we have to keep in mind that those are two entities that need to work together as we somehow try to navigate through these varied structures. I think it's interesting, and those of us who take a little more innovative approach to putting deals together, that where those two entities are not mutually exclusive. In other words, a provider group of physicians, multi-specialty, let's say, does not have to, double negative here, but does not have to not work with the hospital and still find a partnering effort. I think there's ways to do that. And I think by the same token, I've been very pleased with many of our hospitals and health systems around the country who have opened up to other forms of structures. And I wish we had more time to go into some of those details. I could cite some examples that we're working on that are incredibly, I think, innovative, where hospitals have really taken a different approach, and it's not the one size fits all even for them. So I feel that's important as we go down this road in the next 5 years or so. I also am concerned about the number of rural hospitals that are not being sustained over the long term. And I think that's an issue that, again, maybe is for another day, specific podcast that we'll explore, Mark. But the whole issue of the rural healthcare provider and where they're going in this country is yet another serious component that we have to deal with as the future unfolds.
Yeah.
What Max just said there, I think, is very important as people think about the future. And, part of the podcast is, where is all this going? Having had the pleasure and privilege of working with Max and the Coker Group, I know that they are extremely creative about approaches to affiliations among payers, providers, and others that are in the healthcare space. And I think what Max was just saying needs to be underlined, and that is the future of these transactions involves innovation, creativity, new thinking, and new approaches. And the opportunities presented by innovation are amazing, nothing short of amazing.
Well, yeah, let's talk about that, because I think most people would agree that broadly speaking, the healthcare industry has not been as well known for its level of innovation, and that comes in different forms. I think we're getting better and we're progressing as far as that goes. But one of the other things you guys kind of alluded to and looking back was the role of technology in healthcare delivery and the role it plays in the system as a whole. Probably most people have a good idea or some perspective on where technology has been historically. I mean, I would say, broadly speaking, technology as it relates to healthcare delivery in the past has primarily focused on things like electronic health records and similar types of solutions that tie into an EHR platform, maybe, or something that's more on the non-clinical side, such as a revenue cycle system and practice management systems and things like that. But I think as we look forward, we can't ignore the role that technology is going to play and already is playing. So I don't know, maybe if you guys want to speak to that a little bit in terms of what you think's on the horizon out there for technology.
Well, I'll jump in first, and I don't think I'm very qualified. I'm not real technologically advanced. I let other folks in our firm that are much more adroit at that than I. But I can tell you from looking at it and observing it over the years, I can say that we've come light years, and we needed to. Eons ago, I came from the retail industry and into healthcare. And, even back then, many, many years ago, the retail industry was much further advanced in terms of their ability to track inventory, to track performance, and literally maintain a much better focus on that sort of thing. Healthcare was a little late getting into the process. I think there were some reasons for that. We won't go into that. I think a lot of it had to do with the way care has been delivered, which is not bad, and that is, the country physician delivering a cross-section of care to the patient, the family provider, et cetera. I think those roots of healthcare in this country are noble and something that we shouldn't criticize, but I think it also inhibited the ability to communicate and cross-share data. Now we're moving away much further into that sort of thing, and I think it's over time will prove to have much value as we use data and information to make better decisions. And the biggest thing that I see technology, and you got to understand, I'm an accountant by training, so you're probably not going to be surprised when I say this, but I think the biggest return on investment from technology is creating lack or less of duplicity. There's way too much of that in healthcare, and in turn, lowering cost. We have to lower the cost curve of the cost of delivery of care. And I think technology will continue to be the solution for that. And we all have to embrace it, even folks like me that didn't grow up with the level of technology that others have.
Yeah, I think it seems like the role of technology growing in the healthcare industry is coming from two separate but supportive drivers. And I think on one hand, you kind of mentioned it, where it's the financial driver, meaning there's a lot of value that can be achieved, economic value, through the optimization and utilization of technology. There's also, though, the other driver is the clinical driver, and the way we're seeing the type of care being provided, not changing the type of care or even level of care, but just how it's provided, the medium through which it's provided, where technology is playing a key role in being able to enhance the experience between the provider and the patient. And which I'll say, by the way, this is another area I think that we're seeing this intersection of the three key stakeholder groups, and that a lot of the push for technology is coming from the consumer side, where we're used to doing things digitally. And I think the healthcare industry is one of those areas where that trend is going to continue.
Yeah, and I think that is exactly right, Mark and Max, that the technological advances are making enormous changes. Going back to what Max was talking about, the duplication of processes and effort and so on, needs to be eliminated. If you've got 8 similar medical groups in a particular region, they don't need 8 separate accounting systems. They don't need 8 separate electronic medical records. They can consolidate and centralize and obtain enormous efficiencies through that. And then you can scale that from their locale to their region, to their state, to multiple states. And you can visualize very easily how the efficiencies that Max described would be available. Now, traditionally, the HIPAA privacy rules have been an obstacle to sharing information. People have been reluctant to expose themselves to risk under HIPAA by sharing information. But as time goes by, people are learning that with appropriate safeguards, health information can be shared, even by text and other forms of electronic communication that allow for instantaneous sharing of healthcare information.
Sure.
A lot of healthcare lawyers traditionally would take the position of, if in doubt, don't. Just say no. It's the easy answer. Don't share it. No risk. But that creates a huge obstacle to delivering efficiencies and effective delivery of care. So, the changes are dramatic. They're important. And, should I go on and talk about the consumer side,
Please.
About telemedicine and e-health? Yeah. So, and I'm sure Max will jump in too, but telehealth and e-medicine, at least within our law firm, and I know others, is viewed as the wave of the future in healthcare. Because, as you said, Mark, being able to allow people to access healthcare in new ways is a dramatic change. So you just visualize an 80-year-old plus individual in a senior living facility who has trouble getting around. They don't want to go out to the physician's office because they have a head cold or something else. Well, if you could instead put them in a chair in their senior living facility, and the chair is filled with electronic measuring devices. So when they put their hands and arms on the chair arms, it's measuring their temperature. It's measuring their pulse, their heart rate, their blood pressure. And they look into multiple TV screens that allow a physician at a remote site to look at the patient and to have the patient put a camera in their mouth or in their ear so the physician can look at them and do other kinds of evaluations from the residential facility of the individual. It's an amazing convenience and an extremely efficient way for people to receive the delivery of healthcare. Again, there are regulations, rules about how that's done and who it's shared with and who can see it. Those all have to be met, but they can be met. And, we're just on the front edge of this. Only imagine where it's going to go.
No, that's right.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Tom. And I think that it's important that we all, as consumers, I'll put on that hat now, embrace that sort of thing. On the surface, it may seem a little uncomfortable to not have your physician directly across the table or the examining table from the patient. But I think we have to adjust and realize that not only for economic, but certainly there are ways to assure quality of care in a much more efficient manner, that these things are adopted and embraced. I would like, though, for Tom, because I know how strong he is in knowledge, if I may, Tom, if you could just briefly comment your perspective on, and you kind of alluded to it with the HIPAA laws and so forth and navigating through them, but how do we work with great attorneys like you to navigate through the regulatory maze of these transactions, the laws themselves vis-a-vis HIPAA, MACRA, all these things that the government tends to thrust upon us. And frankly, without trying to sound too negative here, they tend to be somewhat counterproductive at times, or seemingly to be. But yet we all understand that the government has a place, and we want rules and regulations and controls because there are people that abuse them. But I would love to hear you comment, because I know I've heard you do it with clients before, on kind of how you see this going on in the future. Do you see regulations becoming tougher? I'll just stop and say, when the Affordable Care Act was passed back in 2010, it seemed to be very inconsistent with some of the antitrust regulations. And so that's just one example. But what's your perspective, Tom?
Yeah, it's a very interesting subject because unfortunately, our legislative activity takes so long that it moves more slowly than the market, than the business arrangements, than the attacks that are made in the system. So it is far more important for the medical provider, the doctor, the hospital, the surgery center, and others to build their own safeguards and then fully comply with the law as well. But everybody needs to understand that the law is a little bit out of date and not moving as fast as what's going on in the marketplace. If you look at the question of cybersecurity, cyber thieves, hackers, and people that want to defraud us view the healthcare sector as a very soft, easy, and exquisitely rich target. They think, and they know actually, that the healthcare information that is included in a patient's record includes almost everything they need to steal property, money, information, identities from people in a way that's almost better than anything else for them, because it includes name, address, social security information, ability to pay, source of payment, insurance information, all kinds of historical data, all in one place, one concentrated place. So cybersecurity is an extremely important topic for both the consumer and the provider, and especially the payer. And being able to safeguard your information, your intellectual property, your data is extremely important, regardless of what the laws say you have to do. There are really good reasons to do things to protect your information even better than what the law says you need to do. And, that includes two-factor authentication, using complex passwords, and changing passwords, and all those kinds of things that need to be done. Because, again, the cyber thieves are way ahead of what the government is mandating and putting pressure on all three sectors, payer, provider, and consumer, to act fast to try to protect their information. So that's one side, it's just the business side. But then to directly address what Max asked about the regulatory requirements, they are numerous, they are complex, and they're out of date. So what do? I think what you do is you visualize the best possible outcome that you want to achieve. You create a structure that achieves that, and then you make sure it fulfills all the regulatory requirements. And to the extent it's necessary to modify your structure and your plans to comply with the regulatory requirements, you do it. But the regulatory requirements should not be the tail wagging the dog. People should put together the arrangements they'd like to achieve and then find a way to build the structure and to meet the regulatory requirements within that vision. Because otherwise, if you just let the lawyers, the regulators tell you what you can do, you'll never move forward. Because again, the laws are kind of out of date and they're rigid. And the way that things are changing, it's not rigid. It's creative. It's innovative. It's new. It's different. And then, building those arrangements and structures is more important. And then meet the regulatory requirements as the second step. But they have to be met. No question about it.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, Tom, and in terms of not letting the tail wag the dog. And we've seen this. We've seen clients that are on the kind of leading edge of optimizing technology in the delivery process. I mean, we've seen it, for instance, a health system that is using video conferencing platform to help assist in the step down care process, so that not every single patient in post-acute or long-term care or whatever it may be is getting readmitted with every call. And, that's one of those things where they can not only manage the cost piece, but the quality is better. I mean, we all know it makes no sense for the far majority of cases for patient routine calls to be admitted to the ER simply because there's no other option. And that's just one example, I think, of where we're able to see there's both that economic value piece and the clinical quality enhancement component as well. But looking at it from a conventional mindset, one may look at that type of scenario and say, oh, no, that's too much. The compliance concerns are too great for us to go and pursue something like that because of the outdated laws that you're talking about.
Right. Our law firm has 12 offices in 8 states. We meet on the video conference multiple times every day.
Sure.
And if we had to fly people around to meet, it would cost a fortune. But using those video conference features is very efficient.
Yeah. And that's just one example. Again, I mean, there are all kinds of these examples out there where the innovators and, the unconventional thinkers are able to really gain a competitive edge there, and what's becoming even more competitive market. I think the other interesting point you brought up, Tom, is going back to the cybersecurity thing. Coker's technology consulting group is spending a significant amount of time here. And I think it's interesting that, again, as we're looking back and looking forward, the idea in the past as it relates to security has been it's more risk management, but, downside protection perspective, meaning we want to kind of reduce the risk as much as possible. Whereas now I think looking or forward thinking here, we're thinking about not just how to prevent as much or reduce as much of that downside risk as possible, but we're truly taking steps and utilizing technology solutions that are out there and having kind of a more of a proactive mindset towards, reducing exposure from the get-go. And so it's not just about managing downside, but truly maximizing value in how we approach cybersecurity looking ahead. Have you seen that as well?
Well, definitely. And, what you've said is exactly the right approach, I think, is the laws have to be met and will be met in every structure. But thinking about them creatively and thinking about how innovative structures can be built that meet the law and also meet those objectives is the key. And they certainly produce obstacles and sometimes produce, a corporate structure that might look like a plate of spaghetti noodles with meatballs on it, a lot of lines going in every direction, but, it can be done.
Sure. Well, as we round out the discussion, the last thing I wanted to touch on, again, we're looking ahead more than anything here, is something you all alluded to earlier, which we've talked a lot about on the podcast and past episodes, but this shift from kind of a volume-oriented system towards more of a value-based mindset. And I think, again, if we're talking about what's ahead for the healthcare industry, we can't ignore or overlook this component, because value-based care is, I think we all agree, is here to stay. Now, ultimately what that ends up looking like is still, I think that's still evolving, right? And it probably will continue to evolve for a long time, but maybe just touch on that. What are your perspectives on this volume to value shift as a whole? And then maybe we can talk about some of the specific areas where we're actually seeing it in action, as potentially as soon as 2019.
Yeah, I'll jump in first. I think the concept of moving, as you put it, Mark, from volume to value is noble and makes all the sense in the world. I think somehow translating that into the real world of functionality is difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. I think that on the one hand, the theory behind value-based reimbursement makes so much sense. And let me stop and pause here without indicting or even inferring any criticism on the provider side. And because I truly believe that most, if not virtually all, hospitals and physicians and other providers really, first and foremost, want to do the right thing for the patient. But having said that, when we incent them to do more, then there is a likelihood that that may in fact occur. And fee for service, fee for volume is just that. I mean, it is. We have to admit it. And again, I'm not suggesting that providers deliberately overutilize, overindulge, do more things just to generate more revenue. But moving over to value, I think value-based reimbursement, I think that will be somewhat mitigated, if not negated. Now, getting there is very difficult because, first of all, who is to say, and I get this all the time, particularly from physicians, who is to say that my value, the quality of my care is better than the next guy? And what measurements do you use? Now, we're working at it, and we're trying to define that and put some sort of quantitative price tag, if you will, on that. Bundles, for example, make a fair amount of sense. If we can aggregate all of the care and coordinate it within a surgical procedure or some other procedure, makes a lot of sense. And I think that is a good start to this process. But it is incredibly challenging, very difficult to put together. And quite frankly, most of the places we work, and Tom, I'd love to get your input on this, the payers themselves are not incredibly aggressive on moving to some sort of value-based reimbursement because, quite frankly, I don't think they know any better than the rest of us on how to qualify and quantify it. So I think we still have a ways to go there. I think gradually it will change, but I am not personally of the opinion that we're going to ever completely move away from some form of volume-based reimbursement. But I do think it will move more and more away from almost exclusively volume-based reimbursement. Tom, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree, Max. I think that volume-based payment is always going to be a component in the payment structure to physicians and to hospitals. It's a question of how much and what incentives are created by the payment system that's in place. You know, we've been looking back and looking forward. If we look back to the 1990s when managed care organizations popped up all over the country, at that point, I left my law firm. I went in-house at a physician-owned health maintenance organization, HMO, an insurance company. And then later I was CEO of a health insurance company before going back to the law firm. In both of those arrangements, the insurance company was trying to get the physicians in the community to take risk through a form of fixed payment, capitation payments, and other kinds of structures like that, payments that were not volume-based. So, you know, you take a group of doctors and tell them, well, starting tomorrow, you're not going to get paid based on how many patients you see, but instead, we're going to pay you a fixed sum for all of those patients, and whether you make money or not will depend on how well you do within that structure. And, you know, the physicians look at you cross-eyed. You're going to want me to do what? When? Tomorrow? How do I do that? And, you know, those structures failed miserably. The medical groups that took that risk almost uniformly went bankrupt. The insurance companies that tried to make those arrangements were not successful. Many of them were acquired by other organizations. And a lot of it had to do with the lack of technology, the lack of information. People could not manage how much people were being paid or how much care was being delivered or what the outcomes were, because they didn't know. They didn't have the information. But now, with technological advances, the information about how much care is being delivered, who is delivering it, what is the outcome, can be done within hours or days. And that information allows people to react in a meaningful way. So if you couple that with how do people get paid, how do providers get paid, doctors and hospitals, and you have the payer community aligned with that, saying, we'll work with you. Doctors will give you that information. We'll help you understand it. We'll create incentives, financial incentives for you, so that if you deliver the care, we'll pay you for the volume. If you then manage the care, you communicate with the patient, you communicate with the family, you communicate with the next physician who needs to treat them, or the hospital, or long-term care facility. We'll pay you for that. And if things turn out well and there's no readmission, we'll pay you for that. So you align all those incentives between the doctor, the hospital, the payer, and then you bring the consumer, the patient, into it and say to the patient, this is what we're doing. Can you help us? Can you communicate well with us? Can you describe to us how you feel? As soon as you feel that way, get on the phone, get on your FaceTime, get on your electronic interface, and let us know immediately so we can do something about it. You'll get better outcomes. And then there are incentives aligned with that. So that's the way things are going. And hopefully they'll continue to accelerate in that direction. And Max, I know you've been involved in creating bundles and service line co-management and clinically integrated networks that achieve these results. And, those kinds of organizations are designed to create those. Maybe you ought to describe some of those to the audience.
Yeah, sure. And I'll be brief. But I think that everything you say makes so much sense, Tom. The coordination of care and the continuum of care is so important. And so part of what we've created that you alluded to are these structures, these models that allow providers to work together. And sometimes, in fact, in many cases, they're not the same group. They haven't merged, as it were. They can work within a clinically integrated network that is truly clinically integrated in the eyes of the federal government, and they can not only coordinate care, which not only in theory, but in reality reduces the cost of care. They can then be rewarded as a group for that control of the cost through higher reimbursement, and in turn make a better return. So everyone wins in when you stop and think about that. It's quality care to the patient, the consumer. It's good for the provider, and it's okay in terms of the payer, because the payer is willing to share in that good outcome and that more efficient delivery of care. So we have gone a long way and made a fair amount of progress by creating clinically integrated networks, the ACO concept that came out of the ACA Act itself, and all of these consortiums, as I call them, that are perfectly legal and they're created in the right way, and really can go a long way. And I think sometimes I'll just close by saying we're kind of hard on ourselves in the healthcare industry to say that we haven't moved as fast, we haven't really progressed in value-based reimbursement and so forth. Well, it's a big industry, and it's a lot of moving parts. It's a huge amount of our what is it, 18-20% now of our gross national product. So it's a big ship that we're trying to turn around, and it's going to take a little bit of time. So I think we have made some real progress, and I think with innovative thinking and some of the concepts that we've talked about today in this podcast, we'll continue to see some real progress.
Yeah. Well, I think that said it very well. And I think this has been extremely interesting, even though we went through some broad strokes here, looking at some of the key components. I think there's a lot here where we could drill down and even, it'll be very interesting to see maybe 6, 8, 12 months from now what changes have taken place, because we know, I mean, any of these, as we're looking ahead, any of these things that we're talking about, they're going to entail challenges. No way around that. And that's okay. And it's not going to happen overnight. And I think we're starting to come to terms with that and figuring out how to work within those confines and kind of all the other things that the discussion entails. So this has been, again, extremely interesting discussion. I really appreciate you guys participating. And I know there's going to be a lot more coming on some of these things. So thank you. And we'll look forward to talking more about some of these things, hopefully on a future episode.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much. Yeah, delighted to be involved. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. We hope you enjoyed that episode of Coffee with Coker, and we thank you for listening. We want to encourage all of our listeners to participate and contribute in the podcast. So if you have any questions on any of the things we discussed in this episode, any of the topics that were presented, please feel free to ask us. Also, we welcome your feedback and suggestions. If you have any ideas related to the material we discussed in this episode, or in any episode, please let us know and we'll make sure to incorporate it. And if you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear more information about in future episodes, please send those suggestions to us. We would love to hear them and we'd love to incorporate them into our future episodes. You can find us online and on social media. Start with our website, and specifically the podcast is coffeewithcoker.com. You can also find that through the main Coker website at cokergroup.com. You can also find us on social media, Twitter at Coker Group, and then on LinkedIn, you can search for Coker Group and find our page and the page for some of our team members as well there. So you can find us and reach out to us in a number of places. And then if you want to contact us directly, one of the best ways to do that, email feedback@cokergroup.com. That's feedback@cokergroup.com. And again, we'd love to get your feedback. And we'd love to encourage everyone to subscribe to the podcast so that you can be notified when future episodes are released. We look forward to the next episode, and we look forward to getting your suggestions and feedback on this episode. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you again on future episodes.